Thank you so much, and thanks to our panelists for being with us. This panel will focus on new concepts, and we're going to dive into kind of what are the new trajectories we are seeing when it comes to science diplomacy. And let me start also with a personal story, which is how I came in touch with science diplomacy, which was in a seminar on the history of the 18th century efforts of Orientalists trying to study but also bring kind of German translation studies to other places. And I feel a lot of the science diplomacy work that has been done in the past was on historical facts. And what we're trying to look at is how are the shifts that we're seeing on the technological side reshaping the forms of engagement we could look at. And Leo gave us an example for potential avenue in that regard. Before I turn to my panelists here in front of you, which I will ask 2 questions each, let me just spell out in more detail some assumptions that I've gathered throughout the day today looking at new trajectories. And I see the following 3. Number 1, we certainly face a global tech race, a global technology race, and we heard that from our previous speakers when it comes to the race for talent, chips, and energy supplies. And that is also the shaping kind of the way of how science diplomacy is carried out. Second, we certainly see a new trajectory that has to do with the fact that we face the need for a global approach when it comes to artificial intelligence. Think about AI alignment, questions about how the technology should be shaped in a way so it represents humanity at large, and that needs a global answer, and not just AI alignment, but also AI safety issues, right? That can't be just solved individually in each country. And the third trajectory that I see, and up for discussion, is that diplomats have more technology in their hands. You know, while in the past it was cherished to have, the pen and the paper, now it's very common to use ChatGPT in the General Assembly or probably in most foreign ministries to draft speeches or treaties. And that's certainly also giving a new impetus to bring science not just at the forefront, but really at the fingertips of diplomats. Now, my question to the panel will be, is this just a renaissance of science diplomacy that we're seeing, or kind of a new romance where we're kind of in dream with this belief that scientists are maybe the better diplomats, question mark, can they help us to tame uncertainty, question mark, and what's really new about it? And with that, I turn to Finja on my right-hand side, who's from the University of Erfurt, who is working on very interesting aspects in the context of science communication. And I wanted to ask you to share with us a bit about your research that looks at scientific uncertainties and how this context of scientific uncertainties could be helpful in the context of science diplomacy. Finja.
Thank you, Martin, and hello, everyone. It's a huge honor for me to be part of this panel today. And yes, as you already said, my research focuses on the concept of scientific uncertainty in terms of climate change. So I would like to start with addressing a common ground that we can probably all agree on today as we're coming together to talk about science diplomacy in an era of technological disruption. I would like to start by saying that I believe that the intersection between the STI fields of science, technology, and innovation and climate policy is the central driver for sustainable development these days. And what we know is that policy decisions must be based on the best and newest available evidence that we have. And let me give a little anecdote here. A few weeks ago, I watched the UN Summit of the Future, and there was a side event on science diplomacy. And one of the challenges mentioned there was evidence-based decision-making. And at first I thought, like, what's the challenge there? And then it was explained that currently the challenge faced is that policymakers often gravitate towards older knowledge, using older evidence. And I asked myself, why? And then I remembered, I'm a researcher on scientific uncertainty, and that may play a central role here. And what I looked at is that in times of crisis, in times of climate change, where knowledge progresses incredibly fast, especially in times of technological disruption, we unlock a lot of new knowledge at a rapid pace, but we also unlock new uncertainties. And these uncertainties are here to stay, and it's up to us now to use them for a good cause. And that actually is possible, and I see science diplomacy as a central facilitator here, because what we need to make use of uncertain knowledge in climate policy is we need dialogue between policymakers and scientists to really figure out what it needs to use uncertain knowledge to really make progress, and do not see it as a roadblock for progress and innovation, but use it to move into a future of sustainable development and mastering this technological disruption. And with that, I want to give it back to you, Martin.
Well, let me just challenge you and stay with this for a second. You know, yesterday we had a welcome dinner for all the speakers, and you were saying, look, isn't it interesting that in academia often we are celebrating, like, you know, the theory of 1990s to address challenges of 2050, and, you know, isn't that kind of a conundrum where we look at scientists that are often, you know, holding on to specific belief systems, right? And it's very hard to bring in this creativity, you know, especially in higher education system. So aren't we just going back to solutions that don't really work? And would it rather increase uncertainty now when we have scientists that say, I don't know, I can help you to formulate a good question, you know, but I can't really give you the answer.
Yeah. I mean, I really like that point that you're tackling here, because what we face in our research, also back at home at our Institute for Planetary Health Behavior, is that working with uncertainty requires a lot of courage on both sides. Courage on the side of the scientists to really see that communicating uncertainty transparently doesn't mean to admit that you just don't know enough, or admit that you don't have a scientific consensus currently, but to say, okay, this is what we know, and this is what there's still to figure out, and we're working on it. Let's make use of the knowledge we have now. And on the policy side, it requires courage to take preliminary evidence and make it usable in science. So I think it's basically courage that is needed to master this, but it's also skills on both sides to really have the tools and communication to really make use of uncertainty. And I think we're on a good way there, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Skills is a good point. You wrote an article which is called, and I highly recommend it, Scientists as Superheroes. Scientists as superheroes, right? Which is about kind of, you know, what are the superpowers scientists can bring to the game of international relations. And I wonder what your thinking has been on that. You know, so what are the superpowers that scientists have that make them, you know, kind of an asset in diplomatic negotiations? We heard some examples in that context from our previous speakers. Yeah, some thoughts on that would be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good question. I like thinking about the superpowers, and I would say that the main superpower, and that has already been tackled in our workshops today, is to establish trust. So I would say this superpower unites scientists and policymakers. So my very brief answer would be, we need the superpower of trust to just navigate this and everything is fine. But I think you won't let me get away with such a simple answer. So I would break that up into two superpowers, one on the science side and one on the policy side. And on the science side, I see transparency as the central superpower we need, and that requires courage and skills. So we, as scientists and researchers, need to figure out how to put our complex and abstract uncertainties into applicable words and metrics and scales, so policymakers can really make use of that. And that requires a back and forth feedback loop. That's what we also talked about with the other authors of the book today. That's not a one-way street. We need to really engage in dialogue. And the other superpower we need is on the policy side, is the openness to really engage with uncertain evidence. And I think if we use the joint superpowers in science and policy, we can really use uncertainty as a force for good to really tackle the challenge of a sustainable future in times of technological disruption.
Right. So when I read your article, I was thinking, look, isn't that too gimmicky, right, to bring in the concept of superpower? But if you think about it, you know, scientists are often seen as the geeky ones, or the evil scientists, right, the ones that destroy, that blow up the world, right? And then at the same time, right, kind of there's this positive aspect of that. And in that context, we have seen, you know, much more kind of reliance on scientific advice, and the pandemic has been an example in that regard. But also, you know, economic issues have been in that regard an example. So I wanted to turn to Ruppert, who is a member of parliament, an economist by background, and is serving in the Committee for Education, Research and Technology Assessment. And I was wondering, you know, what has been your kind of engagement with the terminology science diplomacy, with the concept of science diplomacy, and how do you see that concept changing now in this era of technological disruption?
Well, when I first came, I think we've seen a huge revival of science diplomacy nowadays. And when I first came across this concept, I really started to think about how much the production of science is already international, and that we have to always make clear to ourselves, but also to the audience or to the greater public, that scientific, I'm an economist by training, so I'm always like to think in like a scientific production measure, something like that. So I think the scientific production is basically international, and if you don't internationalize the scientific production, then you, as a nation, you will have smaller scientific output. So first of all, my concept of scientific diplomacy or science diplomacy is how are we keeping up this vivid scientific environment for most of our scientists, and then on the other hand, how if we are thinking that's true, it comes also with a flip side of the coin that the security issues are on the rise. So you never can think about, you never can paint this world of free science, happiness and development without thinking about the security issues with them. That was the second thought was came in my mind. And then there was the third. So we all took away something from the pandemic, I guess. So, and what I took away was the example of the University of Stellenbosch in Cape Town, because they were the first ones to discover the Omicron variant of the virus, and what we did as Germans. And that's where diplomacy comes into the game. We cut South Africa off from international air transport. We closed our airports for everyone from South Africa. And that's how you see how close science, diplomacy intervened nowadays.
So that's an interesting point, because it makes me think about also whether science diplomacy is rather the wolf in sheep's clothing, and it brings me to the aspect also of trade interests, right? I think one critique we've heard, looking at this issue now for a while, is that this concept of science diplomacy is just another excuse to either do economic espionage or a way to scout new technologies that can be instantly kind of applied in a certain context. What are your thoughts about that? Is this concept just a wolf in sheep's clothing?
I don't think so. But first of all, I think that of course it's okay that science and science diplomacy is beneficial for Germany. So I would go this far to say, yeah, we do it because it's beneficial for the people living in Germany. But I don't think it's the first thing is, first of all, the first cooperations we have to think about is, I don't like the term basic research, but let me frame it as curiosity-driven research. And we need corporations there just to have a vivid research environment. That's the first one. The second one is then, of course, you have to define areas where cooperation is helpful. We heard that climate change, I always would add global health, that we have this dilemma in the world that if we are looking at the pandemics of the future, they will arise probably not in the hotspots for healthcare or medical research. So we have to, in our own interest, we have to diversify research all over the world, that we have a world-class research in the regions where we are expecting to be the next pandemics to be. And then we have to think about how we put that into products and to practice and so on. And I think we have to look at the patent law and to IP and something like that. That's very common to everyone working in science. But also we have to keep in mind that on a global scale, I think that trade is beneficially for everyone on a general scale. So that if I was saying that if we are going from this, we're looking at this way at science diplomacy, then we see that there is the overall goal for the overall good, and then we think that interacting with one another on the scientific world, on the economical world, but also as diplomatic partners is a good thing. But to secure it in a way, we have to be honest about the security issues which comes with them, and we never have to play them down. We have the issues about research security, and at least in Germany we think about it more than we did in the past.
Okay, so let's shift gears from kind of the politics of science diplomacy to the policies of science diplomacy. And you worked on, and I'm just going to read this out, the internationalization strategy for higher education 2024 to 2034, which looks at the role of the many aspects in the context of higher education, but also science diplomacy explicitly mentioned. So I wonder, what's your vision in the context of science diplomacy for the role of higher education institutions, right? And there might be a counterintuitive conclusion, which is that universities will in the future play a huge role in educating, the future diplomats, future engineers to be sensitized to those issues more than we would expect in an era where online learning, like kind of the PhD on YouTube is, often seen more valuable than a higher education degree. So what's your thinking about the role of higher education institutions in fostering science diplomacy, and how might that change science diplomacy in the future?
I think that, first of all, YouTube education is great, but usually it needs some time of some sort of place where education and conversation can happen. So I think that first of all, universities or higher education research institutions are still important, and they still not only important for the research work they're doing, but as locations as itself. And then I don't think so much that it comes like that you go to Germany, you do there, you experience the German system of doing science, and once of all, you're a true believer. And you think, wow, Western world, it really works. That's are my values. I don't think it works that way. But what we are seeing is that we are coming in contact with all the future diplomats, industry leaders, with everyone who shapes the future of every country in the world we are interacting with. And we never know when we can put these strings together. Just to draw on one of the examples of the past for Germany is Capaz, where they where if you look about drawing up a constitution in Colombia, they very much relied on their German cooperation in the field of law, and I think that's something we keep in mind, that is strong, internationally orientated higher education system in Germany is of course favorable for the global common good, but also it really changes the position Germany has in the world of the future.
Yeah, thank you. And Leo, I'm going to turn to you. Thanks so much for your flash talk as well. And let's talk a bit more about kind of the role of scientists in this endeavor of science diplomacy. What do you think are the skills that scientists need to gather, and especially those who are, not necessarily exposed to social sciences, that are not usually exposed to, international relations? And what is ETH doing to educate the quantum physicists, that are working on emerging technologies?
The short answer is nothing, basically. And I think we should maybe reframe the question a little bit by saying, what should scientists do? What skills should they learn? Or what do diplomats, what should they learn? Because I think we should talk more about mechanisms of diverting people in certain directions. Hence why we developed a partnership between the UN and ETH. And ETH also is going to create a school of public policy along the American model. You are familiar with this. This is a pretty big change for ETH and for Switzerland generally. So this shows that if you want scientists to work with policymakers or diplomats, then you have to show how they do that. Some people have the skills. They know that science has not got the final authority or the final say on an issue, that there are many other things, that due process has to be respected and so forth. But most either don't know that. We live in a world where the science or the STI sector is extremely international. So how would a Colombian scientist in Switzerland understand Swiss political processes? It's just not possible, right? So you can't demand that of someone. So you need to create mechanisms, or you have to put those in place, which also comes with certain funding incentives and so forth, to direct people in this area. What we're also doing at ETH is on a fairly small scale, but I still think it's interesting, is to have a seminar on science diplomacy where we basically try and get people who have technical backgrounds, so engineering or computer science and what have you, to to negotiate or to simulate a negotiation between two countries. So, for example, you take a case study, Serbia and Kosovo, or Georgia and Russia, what have you. So real situations, and you ask them to negotiate an agreement. And there you have social scientists and natural scientists. These are just master students, so it's very, very low level. But I think this is a way to start exposing certain scientists to another career track. Because I think for 30 years, we've only been talking about MINT and STEM. This was the only thing that counted. All the social sciences were underfunded, and to a large extent, they still are. And hey presto, now we live in a world where the social dimension is really important. You can't just do AI without considering the social aspect. So governments can't turn around and say to a computer scientist, well, why haven't you thought about the ethical side or the ethical principles inherent in your technology? It's because they were not trained to do so. So I think these kind of things have to be structurally organized rather than only put down on the individual.
So let's stay with structures. And what I hear from your answer is let the quantum physicist be a quantum physicist, let the diplomats be diplomats. But at the same time, we've seen emergence of interdisciplinary programs, right? And at the University of Birmingham, for instance, we just started this semester a Masters of Science in AI and Government, right? A crossover of computer science and social science, and also Masters of Science in AI and Sustainable Development. And we've seen a great uptake because there's an interest to get the best of both disciplines, right? So how do you think, and that's a new trajectory, more interdisciplinary programs. And, it's very hard because we still have, those kind of pockets, bubbles where, 1990s theory is celebrated as success. How do you think those interdisciplinary programs could, also enable science diplomacy?
Yeah, so to answer an earlier question about the superpowers or what should they have, I think my answer would have been that both sides need to be more open. So scientists need to be open to the idea that policymakers can shape their research. That is not to say that they program it or do it in a top-down way, but say, hey, have you thought about this part of it or this angle to an issue? And conversely, the policymakers should be open to scientific information, even if they don't like it. And also, but then we're again talking about structures and how do you do that. But in terms of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and so forth, I mean, this debate has been going on for decades within the STI sector. But I do think the moment is really here now. I think it's just because of the scale of the challenges we face. And I think there's always been a lot of interest on the side of, let's say, natural scientists to engage in the UN or what have you. But there are not clear ways of getting them integrated. And I think curriculum, these kind of new masters and so forth are really very helpful. But then these different organizations and policy and science are clearly two of those actors, but also industry are also important to kind of connect those worlds a little bit better. But I think, again, to my original point, that's an issue of structures and mechanisms.
Yeah, no, and when it comes to structure and mechanism, we have seen some change in international organizations where in the past, you were only able to hire a statistician. I remember that well, and not a data scientist. That job profile didn't exist, and now we see for ministries, having campaigns to hire data scientists, having campaigns to hire natural scientists into a field that is not kind of, used to this kind of to those kind of disciplines. Now, with that said, my German anxiety kicks in because I was told I have until 2:45, which means that we have 4 minutes and 30 seconds left to use your phone and ask questions. I've been socialized abroad, but there's my friend Jan who will tell me that it's probably just 3 minutes, be under 4 minutes. So if you like to use your phone, you have the code over there, and then the best democratic fashion that we can, I'm going to crack my neck and read out the question that is on top to honor, or you're going to do this, Jan?
I can do this.
Thank you.
We've been socializing each other. And the wonderful aspect of writing a book together is you become friends along the way and you work through your difficulties in time management and all sorts of other things. Thank you, first of all, to the panel. Round of applause to all of you. Thank you. And also, thank you to the audience for already engaging with us. So we have some questions here. The first one being, what is the breakdown between the hard scientists and the humanities in achieving the goals of science diplomacy? And Martin, chime in as a
I'm just going to do it as I always. I'm just going to read it out again to really understand. And it went down to place number 2. It's like a Formula One race here. So can I take the first question then instead of that one I'm asking myself? And it's anonymous. What is the breakdown between hard scientists and the humanities in achieving goals of social science? Look, I mean, the two of us were just talking about it, right? And I feel there's also this differentiation between kind of the real scientists, like being a social scientist myself, the natural scientist might say, are you really a scientist in that regard? Are you really allowed to advise here? I feel that's kind of, and that concept of science is in flux to a certain extent as well, right? I go back to crowdsourcing of scientific knowledge, right? The YouTube PhDs that we see. So, like that, those are my thoughts. Not really an answer, but I think Leo has an answer to that. Yep.
Yeah, so I'm a trained historian, so clearly I'm not a scientist. But I think that it depends on. Well, let me frame it differently. I think the most interesting areas of research are usually gray zones. So, and it's not in established disciplines, but it's at the edge of something. And sure, you can do it from one angle, but it's probably more interesting to do it from two or possibly from multiple angles. And I think it's again to do. I think most people would like to do it, but then how do you go about it? And it's again, I talked in my flash talk about the three guiding principles. So mutual trust, roles and responsibilities, but also a shared vision. And I think this is maybe the unifying thing, whether that's between social and natural scientists, or to make it transdisciplinary with policymakers, is to say what is our vision. And if our vision is we want to have positive social impact, then in the broadest sense, then that is the vision. Then obviously you can get specific depending on what you do. And the field that you work in. We have a project at the Center for Security Studies with the UN Operations and Crisis Center, and here we have social scientists, so peace and security scholars, working together with AI scientists on this common project, together with policymakers. And this is, I think, you do need a level of understanding of both worlds, or how both scientists tick. I think that is something you learn as you go along.
And just to pick this up, if you allow me, I think we need those translators, right, that can oscillate between the worlds. And we kind of, you don't need to be an AI specialist in everything, but you need to have kind of those individual roles that connect, or connectors, or translated. Jan, what other questions do you have for us? Or are there any comments from the panel on that question about hard scientists and others? Or we take another question, Jan, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there's another question here which has been going up in importance. How do you manage the fact that significant swaths of society in many countries, including the US and Germany, have become almost fanatically anti-science?
So that's a question for our member of parliament, I think, on the panel, where the kind of the news I've seen, were frightening during the pandemic. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is actually frightening, and it's something that if we're looking back in how science or knowledge was perceived in politics, I think something has dramatically and significantly changed. That there is scientific advice is not always valued as just another theory. So that's why we are coping it. So that first thing is actually that as politicians, we have to do. I have coped with two things. First of all, during the pandemic, we always had this urge to hide behind science, and we have to make clear that political decisions are taken in the political sphere, and they are not taken by scientists. And we always have to take responsibility for the action, and not say that is something science has recommended somewhere, and we are just a useful tool for scientists. So that's something we have to do. On the other hand, I think that in the political sphere, we have to talk about the advice we are getting, that we are needing the advice that is really badly needed, and that it has value, that we have to, that we should be able to explain our decision based on some evidence, at least, and that's something, ultimately, that's something also the voter has to decide. So we have to put it up to the voters in the political system to say, well, do you want to be run by people for them science is just another helpful theory sometimes in the day, or do you vote for politicians who say that their decision, that they try to base their decisions on evidence? It's something you really have to put in the we're in the sphere of discussion. You have to be very transparent about that. That if you're voting, your next member of parliament, you have to look, is this someone who is taking science seriously, or is someone who's taking science not seriously? It's something we have to decide in a democracy.
I see Finja's getting ready. And
Absolutely.
has a thought on that as well.
Yeah, I found it interesting that you talked about already earlier in the workshop, and that really stuck with me, politicians hiding behind science. And I feel like if I apply that to my topic, sometimes we also have scientists hiding behind science in the sense of hiding behind certainty. And I think really the pandemic showed how hiding is maybe not the best strategy to follow if you want to foster trust, like public trust in institutions such as the political sphere and science. And that's kind of what I'm taking home with me from this talk we had today, because I find it really interesting to think about.
Yeah, it goes back to the principles you mentioned as well. Leo, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think in this country there's a debate around abortion, right? So you have the pro-choice side who say, but look at all this science to prove that we're right. As if those who are pro-life did not understand the science or were not scientifically literate. Some of them are, but the politicians who lead that clearly understand it. The thing is, it's not a scientific issue. It's a normative issue. And I think generally speaking, in our society, and I think I stress that this is quite new, and by new, I think in historical terms, so 70 years, but it's still new, that we have two sources of legitimacy. On the one hand, we have national sovereignty, and on the other hand, we have science, because science is the best way that we come up with verifiable knowledge. But this conflicts to some degree with national sovereignty. One is normative, one is internormative. One is international, one is obviously national. So these are in tension with one another, and I think what we have to figure out is how, or to what extent, does one supplant the other, or in what moments. We probably don't want a society that is completely governed by science, because that would get quite dystopian very quickly. Conversely, we don't want a society only governed by normative issues. So it's a question of balance. And I was talking before with people who'd worked at the UN, and I think there the idea, everyone is in favor of integrating scientific knowledge in their operations, but the politics are so tense that you hide behind science, or you don't even listen to it, or what have you. But I think you need kind of an overhaul about how these two different systems, whether it's a political system or a social process, not a system but a social process, and a scientific process, how do you integrate that? Because when you define the rules, you can say, to this extent, this is what we know on scientific methods, and we accept that. But then we add another layer, and then it's a question about how thick that layer is. And I think that is something that only a debate can solve, but those structures can be created.
And how much time do we have?
Thank you, everybody. I'm sure people are interested in a cup of coffee and maybe some sugar. We have coffee and tea and so forth served outside. We'll start back again at 3:15. And because I'm German and I'm keeping time, one thing I haven't been doing is I've not been reading out the bios of our speakers to save some time. But you can find all of that on our conference website. So if you're interested in learning more about our panelists just now or later in the day, take a look at the website and learn more about them there. So we'll see you outside for coffee and tea. Thank you.